If you can start a recording locally as well, Fred,
Oh, sure.
can be a
Just
quick turn.
QuickTime
Yep.
player.
Yeah, and it just has to be just your audio and just audio.
Cool.
We're just going to use that as a backup. I think I've had to use that once or twice but otherwise Riverside does a really good job.
Yeah, Riverside is solid. It usually doesn't have problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like there's always that podcast like halfway through the recording, someone just sounds really like it's the Zoom recording that they have to use. It's brutal.
I listen to podcasts at like at least 2x speed, and so if there's anything off about the audio, I'm like, oh no, it's going to be so hard.
Okay, I got it up here. Any quality that you guys recommend? I think it gives you that option now. Okay, I'll just do.
Yeah.
Why it's not? There we go. All right, I'm recording locally.
Awesome. Let me we are live on YouTube, by the way. Hello, YouTube. I'm just pushing.
Oh, we're doing this live on YouTube? I didn't realize that.
Oh, yeah.
Not
Okay.
many
Okay.
people will watch.
Okay, well, everyone here, just this is like we're gonna be talking about like cool stuff that I don't think we've really talked about publicly. So no one tell anyone, and we'll keep it a secret.
Yeah, it will be up on YouTube, but it's relatively low viewers, and the show's completely unedited. We'll do full audio editing and stuff, full production for the actual show.
All right, I'm trusting you,
JavaScript should be
audience.
destroyed.
Did I talk over your intro shit?
No. I was just
He's
testing the soundboard.
testing our favorite sound item.
Yes.
That's a good one. Yeah, I'm always, I don't know, as much as we can talk about this off air. How do you all choose? Like, I feel like there's like a collective of like 20 hosts. Like, I don't think I've ever talked to the same people twice. How does this work?
Mostly through availability, I'd say.
Cool. That makes sense. That tracks.
Yeah. That's like we shoot for consistency, and when the show first came out, like it was much tougher because they just had a fixed set of hosts, and
Yeah.
it can be difficult to get everyone's schedules to align. But when you have, I think we have 8 people, it makes it much easier to find 2 to 3 to 4 that can fill in and get a show going.
Yeah, Nick, I think you're on the second most number of shows after Jared, and then I
Yeah.
think I'm third, and then I don't know what's next.
Yeah. Just means I'm much more available. I'm much less busy usually on Thursdays.
Yeah, that's our like no meeting day on the team. So
Nice.
yeah, you were like, okay, someone like we can do it on Thursday. I was like, okay, that's actually the one. Any other day, I would have been, I can't. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And that actually tracks well for it being Jared and I. We're both in Nebraska, and this is noon Central Time, so it's like lunch break, and I can
Yeah,
just
nice.
roll into it.
I love the artwork behind you, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
All right, shall we roll?
Let's do it. All right. So, quick thing, we'll shoot for 15 to 20 minute segments and just kind of roll into it. I don't have a ton of notes on like specific things, but I want to dig into different things and really contrast between like Astro 1 and Astro 2 and kind of dig into it. So I think
the content collections is obviously a huge thing.
Yep.
Pre-rendering, hybrid rendering or pre-rendering. The idea of like static content that's already pre-rendered. So when you ship your SSR, like the dynamic pages are dynamic, the homepage is static. That's a big feature. And then just big improvements kind of across the board on stability and dev tools. A lot of other just smaller things I can kind of pepper in.
Awesome. Okay. Let me go ahead and I'll play our intro and then kick us off with some introductions. Hoy! Welcome to another exciting JS party. I'm your host, Nick KBall. Ahoy, hoy. And I'm here today with KBall. KBall, what's up?
Hello.
Welcome back to the show. I'm excited to chat with you again. And we have a special guest. Please welcome back Fred K. Schott. Fred, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks for having me on. I forgot what a absolute jam that intro music is.
Absolutely. That's the main reason to be here. I don't think that it's actually in the well, it is kind of in the main show, but
Oh
like
yeah.
the produced show.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You're robbing your audience of that.
No, it's
that
it's
beat,
there.
that
Our
sick beat.
dancing is not in the main show though. If
That's
you want
true.
the dancing,
Yeah.
you got to come to YouTube.
Yep. So we have you back. We had you in, I think it was August. You spoke to Amel about an exciting project that you were working on, and you had the 1.0 release, and it was called Astro. And yeah, the 1.0 release was there, and I just re-listened to that episode to kind of see where you left off with that. And one thing that Amel said right at the end was, if you shipped all of this in version 1, I can't wait to see what you do in version 2. And we're here today to talk about version 2 that is
Setting
coming.
the bar high. Okay, I hope I can deliver.
I have no doubts. So yeah, first off, why don't you tell us a little bit about Astro and what it is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if anyone hasn't been following the project, we are a web framework, much like a Next.js or a Svelte kit, or any one of the kind of many attempts at helping developers build better websites. Our take is a real focus on content-focused websites. So, performance is probably our big headline. We're faster than any other framework. And the way we do that is by really focusing on content sites. So, the idea of you wouldn't really use Astro to build a full like application like the next Facebook, but it would be a great thing to build a blog, a portfolio, a publication site, anything where the focus is on the content itself. And then we give you interactivity, the nice bits of UI that can kind of react to you and run with JavaScript, but they're really focused on these islands of interactivity. So Astro Islands is kind of the killer feature of Astro that makes it really unique. Your whole site is going to be static HTML, zero JavaScript by default, and then you can kind of pepper in the little bits of interactivity that you need, a much kind of more performant model than shipping everything as JS all at once.
So it's like a JavaScript framework that's back to the progressive enhancement concept where you start with HTML, but you're progressively enhancing your islands.
Yeah, the joke is that it feels a lot like PHP. Like we've essentially recreated PHP with that like PHP tag. Like you're writing your server code, but at the end of the day, what you're outputting is HTML with these like, you can still use React, you can still use Svelte. We're really agnostic to the framework. So it's a really cool, it's very unlike what a lot of the other tools in our space are doing, but it also feels very familiar if you've ever used a more server focused framework before.
Yeah, that's kind of the main things. Like when I look at Astro, the main like highlights of it are that you can bring whatever you want to use, like Vue, React, Svelte, and use those. But then also you have to give it a special property, right, to actually get it to render on the client side. Otherwise, it just statically renders it. So
so like we take this pretty seriously. Like you could put a React component on your page, like a buy button or an image carousel. It's just going to be static HTML unless you add what we call these client directives. So client load being, hey, when this gets to the page, actually hydrate it. This island is going to become interactive as soon as it can. But then that opens the door for really cool optimization. So there's client idle, which is like, this isn't really a priority. Like when the browser's idle, go and fetch this JavaScript kind of behind the scenes. Don't impact your performance with first page load. And visible is my favorite one. Like if this isn't even visible on the page, we're not even going to like load the JavaScript. You're essentially going to get this for free. When the user scrolls it onto the view, then it's going to behind the scenes go and load it, hopefully before the user even notices. So yeah, once you start to think of your page as this like collection of different components, you can start to prioritize them and almost customize them to a really interesting degree.
So is all explicit? The developer is always choosing, okay, this thing's interactive, this thing's not. Does that add a lot of cognitive overhead?
What's interesting is you end up actually starting to do a lot more in Astro's like HTML focused syntax. So what's really great about it is like you can migrate essentially like a Next.js app, a Svelte app really easily, like literally copy those components in and you have access to them in your Astro project. So it's a great place to start. But then we found that users will end up writing a lot more in our syntax language, which is like the .astro file. And really all that is it's HTML with a little place for like some server-side JavaScript if you want to inject it. But then you can kind of lean into that a bit more, and that's a little bit more, server first by default. So you can kind of walk the line however much you want. If you want to stay in 100% React world, you can. The overhead isn't too much of a problem if you're like living in the React world almost entirely. You just kind of put that on your page, and then now you're in React, and you can do everything you want to do in React. So the size of your islands is really up to you. Some people build full page islands, like these giant bloated islands. Other people really small islands. And I'm sure there's a smarter person who can make a bunch of geography puns, but your islands are kind of what you make of them.
I'm going to ask a kind of naive question, maybe, but with the .astro files, can you put? You mentioned like having some space to put like server side functions, and I see things like um, what is that called? YAML front matter to
Yep.
specify different things. But then, can you put anything in there? Like, could I put React or just plain HTML or anything like that in a .astro file, or would you kind of have those separated out?
Yeah, so if you're trying to like put like a React component on your page, you would still build that in a JSX file.
Okay.
A svelte gets built in a .svelte file, view and .view. What's really interesting is we've kind of almost like just at the same time that React is trying to figure out what server components looks like. I'd say our approach has been almost like the exact same problem being solved, but from a totally different angle. So what React and others are now trying to do is, okay, we have 10 years of building React as a front end framework, and SSR was this thing that we built so that it would like not have this huge like uncanny valley, blank screen while all the JavaScript. Like let's build the HTML for the user so they can at least see something. That was like that's what Next.js really kind of pushed the boundary of, is SSR should be table stakes, and
Yep.
the industry is generally, I think, caught up with that. But now they're trying to figure out like, okay, well, we actually want this to run almost entirely on the server, and the problem that you have to ship your whole application to the client is actually a problem to solve. It hurts performance a ton. That's like the next frontier of web performance, is the fact that we're shipping an entire application down to the user's phone, right? Which is going to be really slow to become interactive.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about Astro is we kind of get to approach this from much more of a server first, just by virtue of having to tackle this problem without the baggage of 10 years of what Astro is. We got to kind of define it as server first, so that put anything up there, it's essentially a place for server code, that default server workflow with the option to go client side when you need it is a really nice flipping of the model that is essentially what everyone now is trying to back themselves into, but we get the benefit of starting from that place. So yeah, the PHP analogy, like put your server code there, call a database directly in your component. Like you can do that. Like it's all going to server. There's no concerns about that running on your browser and like exposing secrets. It's fully 100% server side. You have that safety. You get cool features like top level await. Yeah, it's a pretty neat model.
Yeah.
It's so funny to see this all come back around, right? Like I feel like we've done this.
It's the PHP analogy. We're just PHP.
Yeah, well, I mean, this question of server side versus thick client or whatever, like this is probably the fourth iteration in the software industry of this. It's really funny. I do have a couple questions related to that. So one of the drivers for the most recent sort of round of everything's on the client, call it the React era. One of the drivers for that was it lets you get a completely consistent developer experience throughout. It lets you not have to swap your headspace between, okay, this is server side versus this is client side, because like we all used to do that. Call it the PHP world, call it the Rails world, or whatever. Like you were writing server side code and thinking server side, and then you were writing your interactivity and your JavaScript and making it happen. So having all of that feel the same was a nice reduction in cognitive load, and it let somebody feel very productive. Now it came with the downsides that you've highlighted. How does Astro handle that sort of mental space when you're thinking about server side versus client side? Like, does it require that big jump of, okay, I can do this here but not there, or does it feel consistent throughout?
Yeah, that's a great question. You just reminded me of my first project, the first company I ever worked at. My job, we were building a UI, server rendered HTML through PHP, I think, and then we had to re-implement that HTML using React. It was like this is like the earliest days of React. We were trying it out, and like we just had to like maintain the same UI in two different languages, two different code bases. But God forbid they ever got out of whack, because then that re-render is going to just totally blow out, change something jarring. Yeah, we've come a long way from that. Yeah, I think what we are seeing is that that DX of its one code base was absolutely like, yeah, that is why React won to the degree it did. It's not just a UI framework. It's like a way of, I guess that's really the SPA, is like it's a way of building your app that you get one code base. You think of your website as an application, and that lets you do really powerful things as a developer. So the DX of something like Next.js is, was light years ahead of anything else at the time, and still is incredible. The problem is I think they are not yet, that idea of changing headspaces is now what Next.js is trying to figure out, or React team is trying to figure out with server components. And I don't know if they actually have figured that out. The idea of, okay, so if I want this to be a server component, I have to put use server at the top of my file as like a special string. Okay, now there's a new set of rules for this JSX file. I actually can use an await in my function. If I don't have that, I have to use the use keyword. How does that work? Like, the idea of context switching was actually one of our biggest concerns with Astro syntax. Is like, are we actually asking the user too much? They have to have the .astro file for the server and then the .jsx file for their React components on the client. But what we've learned since then is actually that feels like the right separation, is that there are just different rules, right? You can make a database call on the server. You can't do that on the client. And trying to pretend that that's not the reality actually is causing more problems that we see in how server components are being developed and shipped, versus just a really explicit, like, let's design something that is really focused on server and everything the server can do. It doesn't have the complexity of user interaction to deal with, re-rendering, and then use the front-end frameworks, which have 10 years. Like, we're never going to beat React at being React. It's great. You should be able to use that. And our idea of reuse is that those can still live in the same code base. It's still the same application. They can reuse the same functions, the same libraries, the same utilities, but the language of expression, the templating language, would change based on where you're living. The separation actually ends up being a benefit, not a cost.
To that end,
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, the reuse sparked another question that I had, which is, so you're thinking about the different components on your page as islands, as separated chunks of functionality. Imagine, for example, I have 5 different React islands. Are they able to reuse the same runtime? Or are you running 5 versions of the React runtime because you have 5 different completely separated islands?
No, thankfully not. It's actually really interesting. It's so funny now with our framing, seeing how frameworks think. The answer is, once you load a React component, you're never paying the cost of React again. So you come with that upfront cost. That first island, it's got to load React, and that's not a lightweight library. I think 40 kilobytes plus last time I checked, just for the rendering engine. It's really funny because you realize, like, oh, the React team, they don't really care about that because they just assume, like, React and Next are so tied. Facebook, React, Next, they all think of it as like, well, of course you're loading React somewhere. So, like, who cares? Pay it once. Svelte, Vue, Preact, they all come from a much more minimalist mindset of the framework footprint is something to minimize. I think the next biggest one after React is down in like 12, less than 10 maybe kilobytes. So it's really funny. React is the one where you do pay a cost. Like, that first island, it's coming with React. Luckily, all the other ones can share it. But if you switch from React to Preact, if you're able to do that, you get a pretty significant boost on that first island. It's not going to have to pay that cost in the same way.
And you can do that with Astro?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And the thing that we don't talk about as much, because it's kind of like the dark magic, like use at your own risk, is you can mix these components in a project on Astro in a way you can't in others. So you can have a React component, a Svelte component, a Vue component. Every framework you want can be on the same page, living in harmony. You can even nest one inside the other. It gets pretty wacky, but they're just islands, so you get that isolation. Like, the idea of isolating from each other.
The ultimate micro front end framework.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the thing. You say micro front ends and people like it's like Tailwind, right? They have a really emotional reaction to it, so we don't talk about it as much. I'm not trying to scare away people who maybe don't care about that, but yeah, we're absolutely a great micro front end framework.
With a focus on static content, or more static content, which is really good. Yeah, I really like that focus for Astro. Like, I think Amel mentioned it in the last podcast, which is why I'm thinking about it, and like just how refreshing it is to like have something that is so focused on that.
Well, and no one's doing it. I think there's this thinking that if we go super complex and build apps, we can work our way back to the much simpler content. Like, I think that's how everyone's thinking about this right now. And I just fundamentally disagree. Like, we get to do things that it's been a year and a half. Like, no one's been able to copy us on this because it's a fundamentally different architecture that doesn't make sense for apps.
Yeah.
It's much harder to remove complexity once it's already there.
Yeah, exactly. So we started from, let's start with this. It is simpler, but we can do things then because it's simpler that others can't. And our goal is to move up the interactivity scale. So if you imagine a spectrum between like really content focused versus really app focused, everyone else is trying to go from app to content and struggling. We are starting from a much simpler side on content. We'll have our own challenges, obviously, but we think that that's a more promising path, or at the very least, it's like the second inning of whatever this is going to look like. So we think there's a lot more unknown to explore here. And what does it take to start from this first principle and work the other way?
Do you see yourself, like you mentioned at the beginning of this, you wouldn't build a Facebook with Astro. Do you see yourself moving more towards that goal, or like some middle ground between that? as Astro
Only
matures?
like in the future.
Yeah.
I'd call out Ryan Carniato's been doing some really cool stuff. So if anyone has been like really paying attention to the story, I would say Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid.js, gets a
Mhm.
huge shout out. His Solid Start framework, which is like essentially like the Next.js of the Solid UI library, is doing some really interesting stuff. I don't know how much of it's going to make it into their final V1. I think they have a real like experimentation culture. But one thing that's really interesting is taking the idea of islands and applying it to something that feels more like the Next.js app structure. This idea of like you can have these like nested layouts that are actually like islands within islands within islands. So you're thinking of your site as an application, but almost like maybe onions would be the better term. Like you have like these layers of it that are all isolated from each other, but then you move within a layout, like from one page to another. You're actually only flipping out that one page inside of the overall shell. So it actually brings a lot of this thinking into an app architecture. It's really cool. It's something that I think ultimately, again, it's the second inning of a long game. So I think there's definitely going to be something here. Our focus still is on the content story right now, but there's some really promising undiscovered stuff here.
So this story of basically meeting less of the demands, but still enough for a lot of cases, strikes me as it's a pretty classic innovator's dilemma style story where you're competing on a new axis, right? And you meet because the existing frameworks have over delivered functionality relative to most people's needs. But typically in that, while you're only meeting some of their needs on the app side, there's some other dimension where you're outperforming. You've decided a new basis for competition. What is it for Astro? What is the dimension that you're going on that nobody else is doing?
Well, I'm going to use this as a pivot into Astro too, because that's definitely what I am super excited about. I think Astro V1, we had a lot of ideas in our early days that like that was all about finalizing, formalizing, and this has really been the first time in a while we've been able to say, okay, let's take the next step forward on this content story and what it means. So there's a lot of features going out with the V2, but I think the biggest one, the one that I'm most excited about, is this idea of if we're going to be content focused, let's really make it like incredible to work with Markdown. So we're one of the few frameworks that ships Markdown support by default. I say frameworks, Hugo, 11D, there are others, but they're more like in the static site category, static site generator. We see ourselves as more like a web framework. So if you look at like Next.js, FeltKit, Remix, we really have this great first party Markdown experience. We're doubling down on that with really cool type safety for your Markdown. So you're not just like getting a Markdown object and then like you have to go figure out what to do with it. These APIs are type safe. We validate your front matter. We let you enforce a schema. You're never going to get like a undefined front matter error again because we actually validate it as it comes in through Astro. You can set SEO requirements, hints. There's some really cool stuff with treating your Markdown as something to be validated and then giving you type safety through TypeScript for free as a result of just enforcing that. So you ever reference something that doesn't exist, you'll get a type error, you'll get a validation error, safety kind of all the way down the stack.
That's cool. And I saw you're exposing it to plugins as well. So when you have that type safety plus you have like the plugin story gets really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, the way we framed it, it's not just like a way to import content. It's this idea of a content collection as like a first party primitive, basically. So the idea is you actually give your kind of folder a name, give it like the blog name, and that's where your blog posts go. And it's an idea of content inside of a collection that actually feels, it's much more than just a way to import Markdown. It's a whole system for growing your Markdown collection, growing your content collections, balancing a newsletter, a blog. You can even put like more data focused stuff. You have like your authors as a collection. So you have 10 blog posts, 10 different authors. You can start to like reference. The implications are really cool. I'm really excited about this.
All right. Let's break right there.
I was going to say, I have more questions, but that feels like a good cut.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
I'm excited.
Right. Anyone, again, my constant reminder, anyone in the stream right now, this is not yet announced. This is like, honestly, the first time we're talking about this. I trust everyone's discretion because this is going to be a big part of next week for us.
Yeah, very exciting. And I'm really glad that this worked out to where we can do it just before or like right up with it. So that's awesome.
Yeah, this is our first time like being proactive. Like I think the Amal 1.0 was like clearly like it was her first show back, and she was like, "Hey, I'm doing." It. I was like, "Oh my god, the timing's perfect."
Yeah.
This is our first time reaching out to people. It's like, oh right, podcasts have like a ton of like normally scheduling, editing.
Yeah.
I'm very, very, very happy that you all were able to throw this in on short notice.
All right, we ready to jump back in? KBall, you said you had more questions. Do you want to lead us off?
Yeah. So I'd love to dig in a little bit more about this idea of collections and plugins and tying those together, because it seems to me this potentially enables something very similar to what you might do. I'm thinking like the old like Rails engine world, where you can create sort of a complete vertical stack of here's a type of content, here's a type for that type of content, and maybe a whole bunch of, I don't know, default rendering or other types of things. Maybe can you talk a little bit about the plugin API and what's available? What can plugins do within Astro, and how that ecosystem is developing?
Yeah, so the ecosystem around Astro is super important to us. I'd call out our integrations right now. It's how you can kind of add all these multiple frameworks working together. The theme ecosystem, we just launched a new theme catalog, so we really care about building that out. And yeah, I think that's where I get really excited around the idea of content as a first-class primitive. There's a couple of cool things that we've seen. So one is the idea of content being like it's schema-based. You can now basically set a schema that is, my content's always going to have title, description, author, these properties. We're going to validate it, but packages can ship their own schemas. So you could have something like a theme. Here's my blog theme, and that would actually expose a schema. Like for you to work in my blog theme, just make sure you have these 5 properties, and I can now validate for sure that we can display your content. So that kind of mixing of like, once you have an idea of content as something reliable, you can pass it around your ecosystem, and people can enforce what they need to enforce. The developer experience stays really strong. You're not getting opaque, undefined errors, but you're able to pass that around. So I think the RSS feed integration is the first one taking advantage of this, where it exposes a schema that's, if you want to have RSS properties, just make sure you have these 3 or 4 or 5, and we'll do the rest. We'll give you an RSS feed without any extra work on your part. We're barely scratching the surface of this. I don't think there is, that's I think the only first party like really cool integration that we have, but the door is open now for our ecosystem and community to start building for this.
Yeah, I'm imagining like, I know there's these like headless or API first e-commerce systems, right? Like that seems like a natural candidate. Okay, here's your schema, set it up, and you can now be selling a product. Super simple. You mentioned blogs. I feel like there's a ton of these, like anything you could call content, there's an opportunity here.
Yeah.
So when you say like you have type safe markdown and this whole like schema like based around that, are you saying like, does Astro expose away, I guess, from like a developer tooling perspective to say like you're writing a blog post, so you need these pieces, like you need a slug, you need a tag or something?
Ben is going to love this. So I'll shout out Ben Holmes on our team. He's the one who built this. And one of his earliest ideas, along with Tony, also on the team, like let's actually expose consistent ideas of like a blog post is this. If anyone knows the Open Graph API or Open API, like there actually is this already like repository. It's like this full, like anything in the world can be categorized via the schema.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about? I wish I had the name in front of me. Open Schema. Oh my god!
I feel like it is Open Schema. I'll look. No.
Not to grind the show to schema.org. Thank you.
There we go.
Schema.org is like essentially like anything in the world can be categorized and schemified. Like your house can be represented in a schema from schema.org. We were originally planning to ship like here's what a blog post is, but realized developers don't really have a consistent idea of like the 5 properties. Like some people like date, some people like created at and updated at, some people like essentially everyone is coming with their own idea because this has never existed. The other problem schema.org has is like there's 100 properties for a blog post because they're trying to be comprehensive. So you might only need 5, but it's probably not the same overlapping 5 properties that I need, that KBall needs. So we ended up really struggling with like, okay, what is a good developer experience around 100 different properties, all of them optional because none of them are required. And that's, I think, the next step here is, can we come up with a consistent, like, here's a blog. So now every theme in our ecosystem implements that same consistent blog type. And now any post that you write, you can almost switch themes in and out without too much work. that would be the goal of this, but the problem is no one's writing their content the same way, so we're a couple steps off. But absolutely, that's so interesting you see that, because I think that was the first thing that clicked for us, is like our ecosystem could become more powerful because we have this feature.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I wasn't sure if there was a way, or like the thing that led me to that question was like looking at the content creation, the content collections documentation, and kind of trying to understand that. And it has like, a newsletters section, for example, and that might have different properties than a blog post, for example. And then like another thing I want to ask about is like with the .astro files, I think it's really cool that you get to own that a little bit more. You get to come out of preconceived notions about what a file is. If it's a TS file or a TSX file, what it has in there, the syntax, and you get to kind of define your own playground a little bit more when you have that. And I've been playing around a lot with language servers, and I noticed that there is an Astro language server as well. And I was curious how that ties into this. Like, is that what's really powering like the type safe markdown and different aspects of that?
Yeah, so the type safety is really interesting. There's a couple of pieces at play, but yeah, the dev tools I think deserve a huge shout out, especially if anyone tried it like the O.O, like we barely had syntax highlighting, let alone like any sort of developer tools experience in VS Code. Erica on our team just has done an incredible job over the last year building that out to something really powerful. So that is what is exposing like the type information back to you.
Yeah.
But it's also being powered by our compiler, and then these content collections are essentially looking at your schema and creating types automatically for you, so that when you go and query, give me all my blog posts, we've done the kind of stitching together to make sure that it knows that blog post has this type. This is actually all powered by a really cool library called SOD, which is essentially the schema validation built for TypeScript. So it's powering both the validation for us and also then the types that you get back based on the type you define. So you give us the title description, we're going to make sure that object has those properties. Set them as optional, they're optional. Set them as required, they're required. It's really, really powerful and kind of wrapped in a super simple API.
That's awesome.
One more thing I'll add, and feel free to slot this in however you want. The idea of being TypeScript like first is something that's very kind of new to us. Like we were a little bit like, we built Astro and we wanted it to be kind of TS for the people who want it, JavaScript for the people who don't, and then kind of realized like, well, we kind of have to choose one. Like we need TypeScript in some capacity. So to support it, it's also so flexible. TypeScript is a superset, so JavaScript is still valid TypeScript.
Mm-hmm.
We ended up essentially just shipping full TypeScript support in Astro. So we never really talk about it, but like Astro there's no way to turn TypeScript off. You can make it super relaxed, but it's this really interesting thing where it's like, it's always on, and it's your choice if you want to write TypeScript or just write JavaScript. Our idea is that we can get out of the way if you're writing JS, but it's there if you want it. So we're kind of surprisingly, especially with this release, like we are like very TypeScript focused and first in a way that I think a lot of other frameworks are still figuring out. But like we kind of just accidentally like built it. Now we can't turn it off. So if you love TypeScript, like we are fully 100% TypeScript at this point, and it lets us do some really cool things. But yeah, going back to your point about the fact that we have our own language, we can kind of hide the fact that it's TypeScript for the people who don't want it, because you're not doing .ts, you're doing .astro, regardless of whether you're using it or not.
Yeah. That's music to my ears. TypeScript first. Obviously. But yeah, I'm very excited
I don't
about
know
that.
if y'all saw the State of JS survey, but I think there's more people writing TypeScript now than JavaScript. So that is
Absolutely.
a wild change in such a short amount of time.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Well, part of the reason is it's become so easy, right? Everybody's packaged everything up, and there's type support for pretty much anything you're going to pull in at this point. And so I think we've reached a critical mass where the default for many, many people is now, okay, I'm going to use TypeScript because it's just as easy to set up as JavaScript, and it's going to save me headaches.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that there's just a huge like benefit to VS Code being like one of the most popular editors, and you just kind of get that for free whether you want it or not.
Yeah,
for your JavaScript.
That's so funny. You could be writing JavaScript, you're still benefiting from your dependencies having been written in TypeScript, because VS Code is still analyzing and giving you that data back. That is probably the sneakiest best thing they ever did for the ecosystem. There's some really cool stuff in there.
Well, and the addition of being able to use like docstring style typing and things like that, where folks who don't like the syntax of TypeScript can still benefit from type safety and still layer that on, and the sort of ability to gradually add types. They did so many things right that have worked out for it.
Yeah, that's an incredibly strong team. So yeah, we definitely, if we had to bet on one technology, yeah, the fact that they're so willing to kind of build for people who don't even like TypeScript is, yeah, a huge, I think, sign of its strength.
Yeah, but also like the innovation of like the concept of language servers, which you benefit from as well, having your own. Like I'm just fascinated by that. I guess I keep going back to it. Like you get to really control this whole world and like what you can present and how you present it, and like have a much more like rounded and personal Astro development experience.
Yeah.
Because of that.
Yeah. There's a couple interesting decisions. Like we are not a Vite plugin. We are very much like you run Astro dev, not like Vite dev. We really, yeah, I think that idea of like owning the experience so that we can control it and make it great. We actually, so for some ancient history, originally our compiler was a fork of Svelte's compiler. So we were actually super Svelte-like in the earliest days. But we ran into that problem where it's like, okay, going back to the context shifting, like how do I, well, this Svelte component is server, but then I'm going to create an island that is also a Svelte component. Like, how do I even know what I, like the fact that we can just kind of, Astro is Astro, it is its own thing, that gives you the freedom to then basically treat every framework as equal versus one is our favorite. And yeah, the context switching cost obviously a part of that, but yeah, we were very Svelte-like in the earliest days, both technically and also in our syntax. And we kind of found, I think, our groove, especially for that more content-focused site, the things we could do that Svelte couldn't do started becoming more apparent.
So this idea of owning the compilation, which lets you do things, Svelte does a lot of magic with that, lets them do some really interesting things syntactically, but also from an optimization standpoint. I'm actually talking later today with Mishko Hevery, who's doing Quick, which they're also doing all sorts of magic by owning the compilation process. I'd love to hear a little bit more about like what types of things are you doing that take advantage of owning that. We talked about sort of having the well-rounded developer experience, so Astro feels like Astro. You talked about sort of being able to integrate different frameworks and have them all feel the same. But what else are you taking advantage of in sort of owning that whole package?
Yeah, that's a great question. Quick is like, I think one step even further. Yeah, to call them out as like they use that compiler ownership to take a really interesting approach to hydration, or what they would call resumability. But this idea of what you can do when you own the actual technical implementation, we're in an interesting spot where we've actually intentionally, I think, shot for the middle here. So we like very much the strength that we see it is that we're not forcing you to throw away your framework. We're letting you bring it with you. That idea means that we still then have to defer to that framework to do the rendering. So if you're using React, we're going to call React. That's a huge shortcut for us. We're just going to let React do its thing. It's great at rendering. But obviously we're treating that island really isolated, not just from other parts of your page, but almost from our runtime. Like it is its own thing running. We can optimize the payload. We can make sure it's fast. But at the end of the day, if you're using React, it's going to be slower than if you had picked Solid, and we can only do so much there. So it's interesting. I think we very intentionally made this choice to not reinvent the entire world, but instead like reinvent the DX around how you use your framework components, and then bringing more server rendering into the world through the .astro component. So I think it's weird. It's such a technical break from the norm in terms of island architecture, but we almost, I think, the reason everything exists is like we wanted to get the DX totally right. Of this should feel super modern. It shouldn't force you to throw everything away. And the performance of islands will basically speak for itself. That's, I think, what we see, the kind of being so opinionated about the way of thinking in islands is lets us still actually, ironically, bring more of what you're already using versus having to throw things out and start from scratch.
I think we're good on content. We can cut there and then go into the next
That
section.
feels like another great cut.
Yeah.
This is fun.
Greg, you're
Again,
just
you'll
lining
always
them
see
up.
me kind of in real time figure this out. Again, at first real like, yeah, this is just really fun to talk about.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a big release. I'm so excited.
Yeah. So maybe we'll dive a little bit into that. I also want to touch just on the impact that Astro has had, since 1.0 and since and like going forward. But like, I want to touch and highlight like all of the number ones that you got in the State of JS survey. And
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, obviously,
yeah,
would be thrilled to talk about that. Yeah. Also, I just want to shout out, like, you guys are making connections that like we aren't really even talking about yet, like the idea of the ecosystem around content and yeah, what you can do around like different types of content, not just blog posts. That's really cool that that's coming through because that's something we're going to talk about more as we go. But at this early stage, we just want to get something out that was really flexible. So
Yeah.
the fact that you're already thinking that way, that's getting me excited. I think that's something there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really exciting. I don't know. I'm really excited about this framework. There's just a lot to it. A lot of simplicity like, I don't know. I can do so much with it. I'm seeing as I dig into it more and more. So I'm excited. All right. How do we want to bring back into the show?
I had a follow-up question about islands since we just closed on islands
Yeah.
architecture.
Let's do it.
All right. So I love the way that you're bringing islands architecture, which is something people have been talking about for a while, but making it centric to how you talk about Astro and what you're building there. There is a question that I have about islands, which is, sometimes the components on our page just can't be completely isolated from one another. And a classic example in a content-focused site is e-commerce. You have a buy button somewhere, and you have a shopping cart somewhere. And when you do the buy button, something has to happen with the shopping cart, even though they may be on completely disparate parts of the page. So how do you deal with connections between the different islands?
Oh, that's a really interesting problem to solve. It's funny. It's actually very different per framework. Some frameworks are really set up for this. So I'd say Svelte, its whole idea of like passing state across your site is actually, it's a primitive that they own, this idea of a store. Whereas like React comes from much more of this Redux, like all your state is managed in one place globally. So everyone has to be talking to the same kind of root for that to work, which islands very much breaks. You have two isolated islands. They have two different states in the Redux world. It really ends up being dependent on the state library you use. So we don't ship our own by default. We kind of leave that to you. For libraries like Svelte, it means you kind of use your own, or for others, even the React ecosystem has newer takes to state management that follow a similar model of using your imports more to manage state than like having to think of it as a component concern or a UI concern. Jotai, I think it is Jotai is one of them, I believe. There's a couple others for, yeah, essentially every ecosystem has one. Yeah, it's a really interesting problem that like different islands are running in isolation, so they need a way to pass state to each other. That's the easiest way to solve that problem. There's different ways to send messages, but you really do want to kind of map it into something that was built for the framework because that's going to trigger a re-render. So you can always like, literally call a function that you've somehow imported across islands, but we wouldn't really recommend that. We'd much more push you to use a state library that works with islands, and we have a couple of those recommended on our doc site if you are looking for advice or guidance.
Would like React Query or TanStack Query be an example of one that would be supported?
Yeah, actually, that's been probably the most interesting, totally independent of islands, is this idea of like thinking of state as almost managed by the thing that's making the request to fetch that state for remote data. That's really interesting. So that's even a one step forward, which is the idea that like two different islands both querying the same data from an API using something like TanStack, they are both going to still share the same cache ultimately. So one will make that request first, get it back after it comes back from the server. The next one will actually be able to use the same cache. So it's like this global shared caching thing, but each one is still managing their own state. You're just speeding up the idea of requesting data. That's a really powerful pattern that actually works well with islands instead of being a hindrance.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, Tanner has done some really cool stuff with TanStack. I'll just shout out all of those projects. There's and which is funny because some of the routing stuff is like very much anti SSR. So like you'd think these projects would not be aligned, but the fact that we're taking over the server rendering actually makes it a little bit more fitting to use something that's just so fully front end router centric. We have this like kind of unspoken like app mode for Astro that is the idea of like some part of your site can just be like the spa. So if you have a marketing site, but then you want one thing to just be your dashboard that you log into, you can essentially just, again, we go back to like that bloated island concept. Your whole page can be an island that is essentially a spa, like a spa injected into Astro itself. And then you can use like a much more front end app like developer experience using something like TanStack, React Router. These things can like, instead of having to build SSR into those, you can almost like, well, this is my admin dashboard. This isn't even meant to be indexed. This is meant to be a super logged in experience. You can still do that with Astro without giving up that developer experience.
What do we call those continents?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, not the trenches. I don't know. The earliest names for this project were all puns on different bodies of water or bodies of land.
Well, shall we talk a little bit about how far you've come and Astro's impact on the world so far? We just did an episode on the state of JS, and Astro featured pretty prominently.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I've been looking at that data too. I'd be curious what you all thought about the survey overall.
It's been
Sorry,
surprising.
what am I? Let me shut up. I'm not the interviewer. I'm taking us on a tangent here. Never mind. Ignore me.
No, I think it's been surprising. We talk about it on a show, so we'll have a link to that episode. But overall, like I think that there's a pretty good, very large set compared to the previous year of respondents, and there's a lot of good data in there. I think that it's very interesting that the like React is still king when it comes to usage, but it's thrown as slipping in terms of like I forgot what they call it. It's like like interest and retention.
Yeah.
Those have been supplanted by other things, maybe like Astro. I think
Yeah.
Astro is number one in both of those actually.
Yeah, so it was a really strong year for us. We actually were lucky enough. We were on the survey last year,
Yeah,
got good ratings, but I think our usage was like 3%. Like we were still V0. I think it showed we made a big splash, but like 3% usage is pretty
yeah,
small. I think that tripled up to close to 10%.
nice.
And yeah, retention and interest were the two that I think we beat out kind of number one slots in both of those. So that was really exciting for the project. Um, yeah, I thought it was a really interesting survey. There was a lot. I did so on my Twitter account. I did like a deep dive thread going through the data because I think there was a couple of interesting things there. One was, yeah, what you all are speaking to, this idea of like, is there interest in something new? There were a couple of the opinion surveys. I don't know if you caught those that really seemed to back that up. Like, one was like, is JavaScript moving too fast? Which is like I remember 5 years ago that was like such a meme. Like everyone thought it was moving too fast. Like ESM was coming out, React had just come out, so like we were still thinking in Backbone. Like it was just like a lot of churn in npm and JavaScript and front end, and like it was very scary. But if you look at that survey, they've been asking that for like 6 or 7 years now. It really stabilized over the last 3 years to a place that seemed pretty like, no, it's not moving too fast.
Yeah,
And this was the first year where all of a sudden like that started to trend back in the other direction. It was a pretty significant reversal. And I think that speaks to I think that comes from an interest in like, or maybe it's like people aren't satisfied. So they're going out and trying new things.
hmm
And other people maybe are satisfied. Maybe they're, they just do something at work and that's their stack. But like they see this activity, they see like the water is like maybe still on the surface, but it's like really churny at the kind of below the surface. And I think that's what the data really stood out to me is for the first time there's like a real interest in a project. So Astro did very well, Solid did very well, Quick did very well. Um, these were all like on the top of that chart of not just interest, but also like developers who use it come back to it. And I think that's what's really interesting. That wasn't the case 2 years ago. Like people were happy with the current state of things and weren't really outside of like our small community, which was starting to grow. But this is a fairly new story after many years of kind of peace and quiet. So
yeah,
it was probably one of the most important state of JS surveys that I saw in terms of showing that reversal of stagnation and into trying new things. Some of them will work, some of them won't, but like there's clearly an interest that is growing into now usage for the first time in a while.
I think tied to what you were talking about earlier, like people are starting to realize that using React for everything is over engineering for a lot of problems. And on that same survey, you can see like React going up and up and up in usage and then sort of topping out.
Yeah.
Everybody's using it, but maybe not everybody's excited about using it anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe some folks are starting to say, hey, you know what? I'm building a blog. Do I really need Create React App or Next or something like that?
You're making me really want to do like a what is every framework's biggest challenge right now? And I think if I had to answer that for React, it's they've hit that level where like the problems they have left to solve are really complicated. And I think their biggest challenge is can they solve it in a way that doesn't alienate your users for that exact reason. It's like not everything needs to be solved by React. Like
yeah,
what they're doing with server components, it's gonna involve like moving your fetch. Like they're gonna polyfill fetch so that it like works with the rendering logic. Like at what point does a library that started very focused on UI like become like the Angular equivalent? Like there's a certain point where you keep doing more and more that you hit that.
Yeah.
So I think, can they walk that line? And yeah, I think there's a natural like interest in not everything has to be solved by this thing. So what does that look like in the future when they actually have a solution? Are developers going to want that? Are they going to keep going for other options in the ecosystem? Or are they going to try something new like Solid?
Yeah, and I think that like when they're that big, you know, they have this much market share and this much usage, it's really hard for them to inject any like further opinion because they're going to alienate someone at some point. But that does leave a lot of room for smaller frameworks to come up and like add opinion to that. Like
Yeah.
arguably Astro does that a little bit because it supports React. Like you can still write React, but do it in a more opinionated way with this like full ecosystem around it to support the needs that Astro is trying to solve, the problems that Astro is solving. And same thing with other frameworks, and they can take ideas from that and kind of build on it. But the core ideas there are kind of solidified.
Yeah. And I'll just say, like, I don't say like it becomes like Angular as an insult at all. Like the best thing you can do is become like jQuery. Like
Yeah.
It's not cool anymore, but oh my God, it essentially became so popular it became a part of the browser. Like that is, I don't think it needs to, like, yeah, a project has a life cycle. I think that I think I'm starting to see that story play out more and more. Where is a project, like there is no such thing, at least there never has been in history, like a forever library, a forever framework. So how does something evolve into that late stage of its life is really interesting to me.
Well, and that speaks to the cycles that we were talking about, right? Like the last time we had this much consolidation behind a single way to do things, it was jQuery.
Yeah.
jQuery owned the market. Everybody was doing jQuery. And then it started to reach limitations in terms of how complex of an application you could build. And so you saw people trying to overcome it with Backbone. And then what really broke through was React and this concept of component-centric app development. And Angular was trying to do it. Like you had a whole bunch of frameworks trying to do that. Well, okay, that idea has won. We're writing front-end applications using component-centric architectures. It works better than what we had done before. React has won that market. What's the next thing that's coming up? We're starting to see this diversification again of ideas and people trying to play in that space. And I think it's related to what you were talking about, the bloat, the sense that all of this going to the client is too much for most situations and it's slowing things down. And this is something that I feel like has gotten a lot of developer mindshare in the last few years. We talked about it in an episode that shipped a couple weeks ago around the rise and fall of JS frameworks. Chris Ferdinandi with his very strong opinions about this, but I think there's been momentum behind this idea that, you know what, we should actually only be shipping what we need to ship, the complexities that we absolutely need to do the job that we're trying to do. And that has traction in a way that 2 or 3 years ago it did not.
Yeah. Yeah, there's, I think we were talking about this earlier, like the pendulum, it's like you solve a problem, but then you create a slightly smaller problem. So that the thing you've done is better than the alternative, but it doesn't mean it's painless because you've made trade-offs that create problems. And then that becomes so popular and it gets so big that then that problem becomes bigger. So now people want to solve that. But like, yeah, I think it is a pendulum. I think the DX that was created by the SPA mentality was so far and above what was there before, but then performance just grew and grew and grew into be, I don't think Astro would have succeeded 4 years ago because I don't think people had the same problems that now, this late in the story, it's only getting worse. It's starting to hit a breaking point, and I think that's where we find ourselves now.
Yeah, I'm just looking through this thread that you have on the state of JS results. There's a lot of good insight.
Great, I would call out, like, I think Next.js, it's the interesting part of React and Next sort of like merging a little bit right now, which is Next.js, I don't think is like, that's a strong project that like people are very happy with. And that's starting to become like, it's gone from like, wow, they're doing a great job to like, this is fairly abnormal. I think it speaks to the fact that like React is so big and there's not really a competitor to Next. Like you can think of SvelteKit and Vue and Nuxt on the Vue side, but like everyone's so framework specific. Like no one really, Remix is I think the first time like I've seen like a second framework for an ecosystem come along and really challenge it. So I really wonder how much of that is like, there just aren't really other alternatives in the React ecosystem, and the fact that React is so big, it just kind of like by default is like the top of that food pyramid. But at the same time, it also speaks to just people are happy, like they're not really looking around for other things. maybe because they don't have other things in front of them, but also, it'd be very different if it's like, I use it, but I hate it. Like that would be, if interest was low, there'd be a real, I think, risk there. But I think it speaks to the strength of that team continuing to innovate. There are huge risks to continuing to change things at this late stage, but there are big rewards to staying kind of top of mind and keeping your number one spot as the kind of most popular. You're not the newcomer anymore.
So speaking of innovation, we've talked a lot about Astro 2, which will be launching right as this episode goes live, or right before this episode goes live. What are you looking forward post-release? What's next on the horizon? What is the focus area for the Astro team coming out of the release?
Yeah, we got a couple things going on. So this is actually gonna be the first time we're opening up our roadmap. V1 was just get it out, and V2 was the first time we really had to step back and like, all right, what's next? We've had an RFC process, we've had an open development process for a while, but that was always a little tough to see into, like what was the status on anything. So we just revamped that, actually leaning on some of the writing that the Remix team did on this. And the idea being that from that process, we will actually get essentially a roadmap that you can see what's being prioritized, you can get involved, you can help out. That's something I'm really excited about going forward. In terms of what actually goes on that roadmap, I think that's a little bit more open. We've got some really cool stuff going on around this term primitives I'm really loving right now. So the idea of the primitives of Astro images, analytics, like how are all these things that you use within Astro, fonts and icons, how are all these things that you use to build your site managed within your project? Right now there's still a lot of like throw it in this directory and reference it by URL, but seeing how successful Next has been with their image component, with their font component, there's some really cool stuff. Party Town is a really cool project to move scripts off of the main thread. I'm really excited about this idea of, instead of going big picture for a while, let's just focus in on these really key features that our users are actually working with every day. So I think we're going to see a lot of that coming out in the next couple months.
That's awesome. So like that's really cool. I think it's going in a really good direction. I can't wait to open up the roadmap and kind of see as that goes forward into 2.0 and beyond. And we've talked about the State of JS survey and kind of, the big wins that Astro has had. But I'm curious if you have any other sources of inspiration for really cool things that have been going on within the Astro community that aren't highlighted on that survey. Like, is there something that somebody cool is doing with Astro right now that you want to shout out?
Oh God, yeah. There's a couple things. So one thing I'd say is, because it's going to be around the time of this coming out, a really cool thing that our community does is every couple of months we will take our open source, our open collective funding.
Mm-hmm.
We're lucky to have a couple of great sponsors, Netlify, Storyblock. We get about $8,000 a month in that sponsorship, and we really take it seriously. Like how can we use this for our community? One of the things we end up doing is every couple of months we'll actually just take 100% of that and essentially give it back to the people who are building in our community. So people have done great, learning resources, great projects, great packages, themes. It's kind of a chance to let the community vote on who the kind of stars in the community have been, and then actually give them this open source funding, which it's exactly what it's for, is for growing and investing in our own ecosystem. So I actually won't really pick any favorites. I won't kind of show my hand. That's coming out, I think, on Thursday of the week that this podcast is coming out.
Nice.
But yeah, I would say that the ecosystem overall has just kind of exploded over the last year. So I'll shout out our themes. I think has been the most exciting thing. Like there was a while where our official themes were kind of gnarly, and we've been investing in ours, but at the same time, there's 5 other great community themes that are equal quality to the new one we're building. It's like, oh, all right, this wasn't before we were the only ones and we really had to do it, and now we're sharing that load with the community. Those themes are really, really strong.
Nice.
Oh man, I just got back to thinking about themes and images and these stuff you're talking about, and how they play with your type safe markdown, right? Imagine treating images as a content type, and maybe it's a folder, it has a set of files of the image at different sizes, it has some metadata, alt text, things like that, and you just plug it in somewhere.
You think, so the meme on the team has been everything is content, because we were
Everything is
doing the
content.
RFC, we were talking with our community, and it's like, what about this? It's everything is content. We talk about content as the thing that your website exists to describe, but yeah, once you start to think in this way, it's hard to shake it. I think that's the kind of genie that we've let out of the bottle that's not going back in, is like everything type safe by default. Because we own the dev experience, we can essentially guarantee that in a way that like we still have to honor this idea of like we're not going to force you to write TypeScript if you don't want to. So those two ideas are kind of in conflict, but I think stuff like Zod shows that there is a middle path there where great libraries can generate the types for you for free without forcing you to write them by hand. So Zod is a pretty big part of our strategy going forward. I think until we find a reason not to use it, people seem to really be resonating with it, and it gives you so much for free.
Yeah, it really is amazing. Now, all right, so as this episode goes out, Astro 2 will be available, and how can people get started with it? What's the one thing that they should do to jump right in?
Great thing to be mentioning that I probably a better guest would have thrown this out at the start. Astro.build is our website. There's all the instructions you need there. There's going to be a great blog post kind of summarizing what's going out. Our docs team has just been killing it with the migration guides, upgrade guides. So if you have an existing project, plenty of resources there for you. And if you're running a new project, you can either do it on the command line with npm create Astro, or nice. Astro.new, I'll shout out, is a website that essentially lets you open up Astro in the browser using StackBlitz. Shout out to StackBlitz. So if you're just kind of dipping your toes in, trying to see what it's about, you don't even have to run npm on your command line. You can just totally in the browser go to astro.new and check out the new stuff.
Oh, that's awesome. Such a great way to just immediately get people going without like any kind of setup. Just take care of all of that and you can jump right in. I love that.
Yeah. StackBlitz is magic. It's very cool. So we're lucky to have them powering some of our stuff.
Awesome. Well, Fred, thanks so much for coming on and telling us about Astro 2 and all of the cool stuff that you're doing. You're welcome back at any time to continue this discussion, to talk about Astro 3 and beyond, and all of the amazing work that you're doing in the JS and web community. So thanks for being a part of it. Thanks for leading us with this, and we'll see you next time.
Right on. Thank you so much for having me.
I don't know if we have the outro music. Maybe we don't.
And we don't get to dance. Yeah, there we go. Oh, the podcast audience is missing out.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn off the YouTube stream. So thanks, live listeners. We'll catch you next time.